Lastly, we'll wrap up at about 11. Molly.
Thanks, Ledley. And it's so wonderful to see so many St. Columba friends in the little boxes on my screen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Molly Reynolds, and I help to coordinate adult formation activities at St. Columba's, including our Sunday forums, which, as Ledley mentioned, we have managed to bring online this fall to continue opportunities for learning and conversation. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers briefly. I suspect that for many of you, they need no introduction, but I will do so briefly, and then I will turn it over to Ray. So Ray Suarez, who is a beloved member of our community, has more than 30 years of varied experience in the news business. He currently hosts the weekly politics program Destination Casablanca for the Hispanic Information and Telecommunications Network, and the monthly radio program America Abroad for Public Radio International. E.J. Dionne is a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post, university professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown, and luckily for me, a coworker of mine in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution. And so I am so happy that both EJ and Ray have agreed to join us for this conversation. With that, I will turn it over to Ray.
Thanks a lot, Molly. EJ, it's great to see you, even under these bizarre circumstances. And to my St. Columba's family, I miss you all, and hopefully we'll be seeing each other in a more normal setting before too long. EJ, before we dig into your book, which brings up a great many themes which broadly press on the American future, let's talk a little bit about this breathtaking week that we're just finishing. It would seem odd to talk about the great big themes first and then get to the bizarre week we just went through later. So let's start there. What do you make of what's going on right now?
You know, I knew that the great journalist in you would go there right away, Ray. So I've tried to think about this. Let me just say at the outset, I am so happy to be here. I wish I could be at your great church. I used to live up the street on Albemarle from it. I love St. Columba's and Molly and Ray. I love St. Columba's, as I told Leslie before, because I think it really embodies a very old Christian tradition that marries faith, reason, and civic engagement. And Lord knows anyone who is either a journalist or a think tanker has to love St. Columba's because this congregation is full of people like that. I love Molly because she's been my colleague for many years. And those of you who are on the older side, as I am, know that whatever the problems of getting older, one of the joys of getting older is to meet people when they were very young. I first met Molly when she was the research assistant to our great friend Tom Mann. And to know when you meet somebody, they're going to be an enormous success and make a big difference, and then watch that happen is such a joy. I love Molly, and I was so happy when she called me. And I love Ray Suarez. This is a person who has been way ahead of the curve on particularly, appropriately for today, on issues related to religion and politics. He wrote a great book about that. Maybe we can talk about that book too today. But also has just been such an important voice in national journalism on so many topics. He's also a New York City guy, correct? My memory
That's right,
is
Brooklyn.
Yes, and my wife is from Brooklyn. I have a great love for New York City and Brooklyn. Although he, like my wife, is from the old Brooklyn. It's a very different place these days. So anyway, I love being here. What a strange week indeed. And I just want to report that one of the first pieces of news that popped up on my phone this morning was that in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, Biden suddenly had a 14-point lead. Now, this poll was obviously done before, as far as I can tell, before the news of the president's illness was fully known. But I think that tells us a lot about the impact of that very, very strange debate. I had the odd job that night of being on a live chat on the Washington Post, so that all your immediate reactions are public, which is not always a good idea for any of us, but my job that night was to do it. And it struck me fairly early on, I used the word obnoxious for the president's behavior in the debate. And as it went on, it struck me that this was not a good strategy. Yes, he threw Biden off his game a little bit, but in the end, I think he actually made life much easier for Biden because to the extent that Biden did not have the absolute breakthrough performance he would have liked, almost all of Biden's problems could be attributed to the president for interrupting and for really, I thought, nasty moments. The one that bothered me the most, just as a human being, was when Joe Biden raised his son Beau and talked about his military service. Now, granted, Biden was taking a jab at Trump for Trump's comments on people who had served in the military, but without a word of sympathy for Biden as a parent who lost his son, or honor to Beau for his military service, shifted instantly to an attack on Hunter Biden. I think for many people in that audience, including people who didn't particularly like Biden, including, I suspect, some Republicans, that sort of was a moment that typified something that people really don't particularly like. I'm being charitable about this president. Now the illness and I had a conversation yesterday with a bunch of friends who get together on Zoom every week just to chat about politics, and that one of them is a pollster, and we were kicking around, will there be any sympathy for the president, some kind of sympathy vote? Our hearts go out to anybody who has gotten COVID at some level, no matter how we might feel about politics. I have a hunch, but it's only a hunch, and hunches can be wrong. By the way, just in terms of prediction, I want to say that I resigned my membership in the Prognosticators Union at midnight on election night 2016. But since you can't chase a bookie from the track, I will probably still offer some predictions anyway, but take everything with a grain of salt. I'm inclined to think that the bigger problem for President Trump is that this put the coronavirus squarely back at the center of the conversation, put his own policies toward the coronavirus squarely back at the center, his own attitude toward wearing masks at the center. So I would be surprised if this produced a helpful sympathy vote for the president, but it might pull a few of his people who were straying back. But on balance, I think that the trajectory that Wall Street Journal NBC poll may be a little high for Biden, but that does feel like the trajectory this race is on right now.
It's interesting to me, and perhaps revealing, that you mentioned the debate and you mentioned the president's COVID diagnosis. Inside this week, here it is Sunday morning, Monday was the day that the tax story broke, and you didn't even mention that because stuff keeps building on top of stuff, which in a normal season, we'd still be talking about that story. But so much breathless novelty and craziness builds on top of itself in the Trump world that that's sort of been chased out of the papers and off the front pages.
I think I used a line in the book that Trump is the only politician in history who pushes back against one scandal with a new scandal. And I really think that was very important back in 2016, where Hillary Clinton suffered from the fact that there were only, bang, 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 the same subjects coming back all the time. Benghazi, the server. God, think of the server. Boy, was that a big deal, right? That was a sarcastic comment. Whereas with Trump, everything keeps coming at him. And so one thing pushes aside another. So you're absolutely right. The tax story would have been a very big deal. I'm not sure that entirely goes away. I think there is going to, my colleague David Ignatius at the Post wrote a column on what I think is, Trump paying only $750 in taxes That was very helpful to Biden. It's actually almost better than zero because 750 is a number people can grab even more than the number zero. But I think it's the debt he would bring into a second term for over $400 million in debt, and how, as David argued in his column, that this would be a problem for people running security clearances on public officials, on diplomats, on others. I'm not sure it will go away, but your point is 100% right, that this is such a strange year that a blockbuster story has been displaced by, within a few days.
Now to Code Red, EJ's new book. See,
and thank you, Joshua
I'm doing
Daniel,
this because he's too classy to do it, so I'm going to do it.
I'm not beneath that, so thank you for saving me, Ray. I'm grateful. I've got one right next to me here.
I recommend it to you all, if only for the thumbnail rapid-fire history that one chapter takes us from the 80s to the 2020s, which basically gives us a quick thumbnail review of the last 40 years in American politics, reminding you of things that maybe you've forgotten in the shadows of history. But the parties come to us today in 2020 in ways that were shaped by this most recent era, maybe dating from the Carter administration and the Iran hostage crisis till today. How they deal with challenges, how they speak to the public, how they shape reality when they go out to their public to persuade them to vote. And, EJ, I am struck by the way the Republicans, certainly since the 104th Congress came to town with the Gingrich Revolution, have changed the game. It feels like something about the way our elected officials talk to the public, to and about each other, was changed significantly in that early 90s time. With the arrival of the Clintons in Washington in 1993, and then the arrival of the 104th Congress, it seems like there's no way of going back to that pre-1992 election time.
Another thing that does make you realize you're on in years is when an event that is so live in your own life is now a historical fact. I happened to get an email from an undergraduate who is writing his undergraduate thesis on the Gingrich years as a turning point in our politics, leading us down the path we are on. That's a very plausible thesis. It's only troublesome that for this student, that's really old history. And for us, of course, for many of us on this call, it's a very, very live memory. I thank you first of all, thanks for the comment on history. History has always been one of my favorite things. And my degree isn't in it, but before we became really close friends, Morenstein wrote a book, wrote a review of my first book, and mentioned that I was a PhD historian. I do have a PhD, but it's not in history.
It's in
and I always told
it?
Norm I never asked for a correction because I loved having that word associated with me. Let me do the quick pitch for the book, which puts this in context. The quick argument of the book is that at this moment, progressives and moderates are natural allies. For two fundamental, well, really three reasons. The first is Donald Trump and the threat to the country he poses. I'd be happy to make that argument. I'm not sure I need to for most of the people on this call, though I welcome dissent on that point from anyone who cares to bring it. Second, that the radicalization of the Republican Party that is inherent in your question means that many people who might once have considered themselves moderate, let alone liberal Republicans, have no home really other than as independents allied with the Democratic Party or as Democrats. And if you wonder why there are so many internal arguments in the Democratic Party, it's because that party must now span the space once occupied by moderate Republicans all the way over to people on the left. And our whole conversation, I think, moved to the left after the 2008 economic crash, where a lot of people's views about unregulated capitalism, including, by the way, Republicans like Marco Rubio and Josh Hawley, you couldn't really say after 2008 some of the things about the market that you said before. But all these people are homeless. I had the experience of meeting with a bunch of the new Democrats elected in 2018 from these suburban districts. And just for fun, I said, 30 years ago, some of you might have been elected as moderate Republicans from the districts you're in. And about half of them were deeply offended that I would think that they would ever have been Republicans. But half of them said, yeah, it's very possible that I would have been a moderate to liberal Republican, like Connie Morella out here in Bethesda, where I am, who was very, very popular among Democrats, a very progressive Republican who eventually lost her seat. But the third reason that I think moderates and progressives are allied is because Republicans are not interested in governing across a broad range of issues anymore as they used to be. Think about Obamacare. Obamacare was rooted in ideas that were originally put forward by Republicans that Republicans lost interest in. The Republican Party is really focused on deregulation, tax cuts. That's the traditional party, and is now defined by Trumpism, which I argue in the book, as you know, is not something that was imposed by the outside from the outside on the Republican Party, but has real organic roots. So last point I'll make just on the theme of the book is I was arguing when I wrote it that on a whole lot of issues, moderates and progressives, or center, left, and left, were closer than either side wanted to acknowledge. They might argue about single-payer healthcare versus finishing the job of Obamacare, but they all wanted to cover everybody with affordable health insurance. They might disagree on the particulars about how you fight climate change, but they all agreed that very strong action was needed. They might disagree on Bernie Sanders' free college proposal, but everybody agreed you need to do a lot more to help people either go to college or have other forms of post-secondary training. And if the one advertisement I make for the book is, I think these agreements that have been reached between Biden on the one side and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie on the other side, all book authors say this, but I'll say it anyway, kind of indicate the thesis of the book, because they have come to a kind of middle ground on healthcare where Biden says, yes, I'm willing to go a little farther. Let's lower the eligibility age for Medicare, which, by the way, I think is politically very smart, because 23 million voters, including 1 million in Florida, would suddenly become eligible for Medicare. Biden said, I can't go all the way on free college for everybody, but at public universities, but let's do it for people $140,000, $45,000 or under. And while he has not proposed the Green New Deal put forward by AOC or Eddie Markey, Ed Markey, I'm from Massachusetts, he's Eddie to me, Biden has taken a very strong position on that. So to go all the way back, Gingrich created a new politics. He was really building on what Goldwater started. He took it to a new place, and it's only gotten worse since, is the short answer.
I want to dig in a little bit on this idea that progressives and moderates are natural allies. When I talk to people who consider themselves on the left, they are angry that the Democratic primary season turned out the way that it did, with so many candidates folding their tent and falling in behind Joe Biden as early as they did. They think that this was some sort of skullduggery to deny the nomination to Bernie Sanders. But there's something deeper than that. They also think that once again, they're being asked to vote for someone whose policies they don't like in order to get some future where maybe somebody will listen to what they want for the future of the country. That instead of saying, this is what we want, and we want it now, and we're numerous enough to demand it, they are being told by moderates, by the Democratic establishment, look, you can't win on your own, so we're your only game in town. And they are not happy at all. They don't like lesser of two evils voting. And they're angry that they feel that once again, they're being presented with that choice. And that includes a lot of first-time voters, like someone I actually raised from infancy to adulthood, who is extremely pissed off, even as she heads to excitedly make her first presidential year vote.
You know, I think what you just said describes 2016 better than 2020 in the following way. There's a bumper sticker out there that Warren people have that has Biden in big letters, and underneath it says, even though I wish it were Elizabeth Warren, and in smaller letters. And here's what I think. You're onto something. I think that there is a sentiment out there on parts of the farther left, and a disappointment on the parts of Bernie and Warren voters that their candidate didn't win. But what you're seeing in the polling is quite different this time than what you saw at the last time, that there is far less tendency to say, I'm voting third party. And obviously the vote for Stein, I think in 2016 really mattered in those 3 states that flipped because the margins were so small. And yes, Biden has some work to do to make sure that some of those young people get to the polls, but the studies, but the recent poll out of Harvard's Institute of Politics suggests that young people are actually quite determined to vote, and they're going to vote overwhelmingly for Biden. I think that lastly, Bernie Sanders, his behavior this time versus last time is kind of night and day. Bernie himself fell in early behind Biden, and he's done so with some enthusiasm, and some of that's personal. We should all remember this in our lives, that when you're nice to people that other people aren't being nice to, they remember. And when Bernie first got to the Senate as kind of an outlier, Joe Biden reached out to him, and that matters to Bernie. The other thing that matters to Bernie, and this was really powerful in his speech that Biden gave last week in Michigan, Bernie really believes Joe Biden cares about working class people, that is part of who Joe Biden is. That really matters to Bernie, and he's trying to convey that to his own constituency. So I think you're right that Biden has some work to do to make sure young people turn out in sufficient numbers to win the election. You're also right that there are going to be some arguments after Biden is elected within this very broad coalition that Biden is winning. But I don't see his confronting the problems he did, that Hillary did in 2016. The last point, my favorite thing ever written about lesser evil voting was written by Barney Frank, former congressman. He represented my hometown for a while back in Massachusetts. And he represented the ward I was in, I think the whole time he was in Congress, the ward I grew up in. Barney once wrote a piece saying, the only candidate I ever voted for without any doubt was myself the first time I ran. When I ran for re-election, I looked at my record and I realized there were some things I didn't do so well, but I looked at my opponent and I decided to vote for myself again. It's an old tradition. There is no perfection on this earth, as I think the pastors of St. Columba's would agree.
Are the two parties once in office marked under a different set of rules, judged for performance on a different set of rules? I've been thinking about this a lot because of the tremendous gap between what the Republican Party in its modern iteration has said it wants and stands for and what it actually does. When in 2016, Donald Trump said that he was going to lower taxes, significantly raise military spending, and balance the budget, I knew he couldn't do that. And a lot of people knew he couldn't do that. And that was a big selling point among people who then went on to vote for him. But now nobody's saying, hey, you didn't do those things. Hey, you didn't build the wall. Hey, you didn't make Mexico pay for it. Hey, you didn't balance the budget, even in the 3 years before the COVID-induced recession. I wonder whether the report card that parties get from both their partisans and in the wider society, because Democrats actually behave as if they want government to work, they might be held to a slightly different standard, which makes it tough when you either want to run for re-election or come in from the outside and run for election to an office.
As Richard Nixon used to say when he didn't want somebody to ask a question, I'm glad you asked that question. I think it's become very clear that Republicans care passionately about the deficit when Democrats are in power and are trying to spend a little bit of money on social programs. And Republicans don't care in the least about the deficit when they are in power and want to cut taxes. And if that isn't clear by now, after 40 years, then I don't think people are just not willing to acknowledge reality. Ronald Reagan had no problem cutting taxes in 1981, even though it increased the deficit substantially. Now you could make a case that it was Keynesian. It was actually, good liberal politics to run a deficit during a recession. Fair enough, but and they used to have at least a little bit of guilt about it. Somebody like Bob Dole cared enough about the deficit that he passed a bill. You've been a pretty big tax increase, taking back about half of the deficit. George H.W. Bush, to his everlasting credit, acknowledged that deficits mattered enough that he too was willing to do some very unpleasant things to cut the deficit. But as time has gone on, Mario Cuomo used to say that the problem with committing sin is it gets easier every time you commit it. The Reverend Mario Cuomo. I think now it's just abundantly clear that Democrats are held to a deficit standard, Republicans aren't, because the Republicans, I guarantee you, if Joe Biden wins this election, we are going to hear Republicans talking about a deficit that they have been largely silent about for 4 years. And, at some point, maybe this will penetrate. But I don't know. It is so deeply embedded in the American consciousness that no matter how many times Democrats step up and close deficits like Bill Clinton did, it doesn't seem to matter. We'll find out if Biden wins when he needs to push us further into deficit just to get us out of this pandemic. I mean, Congress should be enacting another round of relief and stimulus right now. And if they don't do it before the election, it's going to happen next year.
I was reminded of this during the debate. In little interstitial moments between all the shouting and interrupting, the president was goading Biden about the fact that he was going to raise taxes. And it reminded me of the 1984 presidential debates when Walter Mondale said, "We're going to have to raise taxes. I'm telling you the truth about it. He's not." And he pointed directly to Ronald Reagan, who was on stage with him. But now Democrats play rope-a-dope. They cover up with their boxing gloves. They lean against the ropes. Joe Biden would never turn to the president and say, "Look, of course I have to raise taxes, and here's why." They are so cagey and uncomfortable about it because I think they've understood that we can no longer talk to the electorate like they are a collection of 150 million adults to whom you can make a case, or at least not in that venue, in the heat of a debate stage. It sounds like you're giving some sort of freshman economics seminar and everybody's eyes roll back in their head and the TV commentators say, "Oh, that was a big mistake." It's weird, but we can't talk to people like they're adults who have actually balanced their checkbook, read bank statements, know whether they've got money in the bank or not, and so on. I think this is a persistent weakness for one party over another, which is willing to just say fanciful things and be rewarded for it.
Well, I think every Democrat since Bill Clinton has run for president promising to increase taxes on the rich. It's something that we don't actually pay much attention to. That Bill Clinton had an economic plan that said flatly, yes, he said he'd have a middle class tax cut, but he said flatly, we need to raise taxes on the rich to balance the budget. Barack Obama said the same and actually did it. He got the top rate raised back when he was elected, and Joe Biden really also wants to raise taxes on the wealthy, raise taxes on capital, raise taxes on corporations. What Democrats have been more and more skittish about is raising taxes on the middle class. And over at Brookings, our colleagues, Molly and my colleagues, Bell Sawhill and Richard Reeves, who are not radical people, very middle of the road progressive people, make the case that actually at this stage, because of economic inequality, raising taxes on the middle class may actually be counterproductive. They have a whole tax proposal where they drop income taxes on people earning up to 100 and some thousand, raise tax on the wealthy. Now, they would tax middle class people with a value added tax, but I don't blame Democrats. I'm sort of skittish about skittish not for political reasons, because I'm not running for office, but for policy reasons, on the government stepping in and taking income away from struggling people. But I do think taxes should go up on wealthy people. I just think that Biden in that debate never got around to saying what he actually had in mind. And what Democrats tend to do, and here I agree with you, will say, I'm not going to raise taxes on the middle class, and they leave it at that and let other people look up how their taxes might go up if they're rich enough to have to pay them. That's fairly normal politics. It's less than fully honest, but it doesn't bother me too much. I'd have a certain leeway if the other side were within that bound of candor. That would be all right with me. But I think there is a problem with raising taxes on people below. We can decide where we draw the line: 100,000 a year, 120,000, certainly below 75,000, because those folks are often struggling in the metro areas they live in.
Molly, is it
Are you
time for
there?
questions? Yes, you did.
We can move to questions. And yes, EJ, you are back. I'll remind folks to put your questions in the chat. I'm going to take advantage of the moderator's privilege to ask a question of EJ to start, which is, so EJ, in your book, one of the kind of things that you outline for this alliance between progressives and moderates is this idea of a politics of remedy and dignity, which as an Episcopalian strikes me at my, that resonates with me deeply. And so it makes me wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of in the Democratic Party on the left, how do you see people of faith helping to kind of advance this model that you're calling for, this notion of a politics of remedy and dignity?
I thanked Ray for his question. I'll say God bless you for your question. Obvious, as some people here know, I'm a progressive Catholic, and progressive Catholics and Episcopalians are sisters and brothers on all of these kinds of questions. For those who might be interested, I have a piece coming out in Commonweal magazine, a critique of where the church leadership has been, but it's also an embrace of the richness of Catholic social thought, which a lot of it, which I think overlaps very closely to where a lot of Episcopalians and other progressive social justice Christians are. So I think that the politician who really began talking a lot about dignity was Sherrod Brown in Ohio. And he gave a series. I was out covering him. In this book, I write a chapter about the 2018 elections, which I think could end up being quite predictive of what happens this November. We'll see. but I spent a weekend with Sherrod Brown, a part of a weekend, and he talked constantly about the dignity of work. And he was talking directly to not only the broad Democratic constituency that stuck with Clinton, but he was also talking about those Democrats who had strayed with Trump and felt disrespected either by the party or by the economy, who felt they had made a deal with the economy that was broken. And I've been thinking a lot about dignity, but of course, I covered the Vatican, and dignity is a deeply Christian word. It's a word I covered the Vatican in the days of Pope John Paul. And on economic questions, John Paul was very progressive, and the whole of Catholic social teaching, really Christian social teaching, is rooted in the dignity of every person in God's eyes. And so this idea of equal dignity is so important, and I think it resonates with so many people. I have recently, I just got in the mail a book from Britain called The New Working Class by a woman called Claire Ainsley, who's an advisor to the new Labour Party leader out there. She also talks about dignity. And then in my book, I cite, because I honor his really fleshing this out, Gene Sperling, who worked for President Clinton and President Obama, and wrote a very good book called Economic Dignity, which kind of fleshes out what dignity requires. I think that dignity is a concept that, we should all rally to, because a lot of my politics really come down to the idea of the equal dignity of every human being. And a society that fails to recognize that is not living up, not simply to a Christian ethic, but I think to an ethic of basic decency. But I think it's also an ethic that appeals across many of our lines of division. The opening quotation in the book is from Robert Kennedy. And I think, again, those of us who remember, or those who have looked back to that time, Robert Kennedy really was talking about dignity when he appealed simultaneously to white working class people and African Americans, Black Americans, and Latinos, who were also at each other's throats in that period, but Kennedy was able to bring them together. And I think we need leadership in the country who, by speaking about dignity, might have a shot of pulling the country closer together than it is now. So thank you for that.
And, EJ, I'm glad you brought up John Paul II, because he was much beloved of conservative Catholics who cheered at his critiques on human worth behind the Iron Curtain. And I was a Vatican reporter for a time, and I used to say to them, well, if you like John Paul II on communism, you should see what he says about capitalism. And
amen to that.
They were totally shocked.
No, I always said that my right-wing friends really loved trade unions when they were in Poland. And if only they could be as sympathetic to unions in the US as they were to Solidarity, that would be a good thing. But you're right. I mean, John Paul actually was conservative in certain important ways, but his encyclical on labor is an extraordinary document that, that Rich Trumka could be waving every day of the week. So you're right about that.
Molly.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to pose a couple of questions that have come in about racial justice in relation to your book, EJ, and just the election more generally. So would you talk about how faith should influence people's voting as they think about the candidates and how they've talked about white supremacy, police violence against African Americans and other people of color, and just generally talk about how racial justice and how that'll be a factor in the election.
By the way, I just noticed on the chat, Beverly, bless you for still being a moderate Republican. The world needs more of you in this in going forward. I think the shift in public opinion, people have talked a lot about how there was a big shift in approval of Black Lives Matter, and then a little bit of a receding positive view over the last month or so. But I think that when at the end of it all, I think you are seeing a country that is much more aware. Basically, this is really saying, I think you're seeing white Americans far more aware of the need to re-engage the battle for racial justice, not to leave things where they are. And I would commend to people Adam Serwer's really great piece in The Atlantic about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where he made a pretty plausible case that we might be on the verge of a third Reconstruction. We had the original Reconstruction after the Civil War that was overturned, often by violence, by the way, violence at the polls, where we're replacing racial equality with Jim Crow. Then we had the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights era, where there is some pushback against that now. And he argues that there's room for a third Reconstruction that faces up to the degree to which racial injustice is still embedded in our country. And I think I'm a kind of glass 1/10 full person, so I want to agree with him, but I think he makes a pretty compelling case. Just to go to the book, I have the book was obviously written before this latest upsurge in, before the killing of George Floyd and others that has led to this upsurge in demands for real action in this sphere. I argue that there's been an argument in the Democratic Party, well, our lefty friends focus too much on identity. We need to focus on class. And the other side saying, wait a minute, identity really matters because racism really matters and nativism really matters. I argue that you need a politics of both distribution and recognition, that if you really care about social justice, you cannot deny that there are particular forms of inequality that affect especially Black Americans, but also affect immigrant groups, that affect women, LGBTQ people. And somebody saying, well, let's have less identity politics usually sounds to anybody who is Black or Latino or LGBTQ, often women, usually sounds like, let's not care about these groups anymore. So we need to worry about them. But that cannot be to the exclusion of a politics that deals with class inequality that affects white people as well as Blacks and Latinos. A large part of the working class is Black and Latino, but a very significant part of the working class is white, and they have suffered in the last 30 years from technological change, deindustrialization, and these communities all over the Midwest shifted toward Trump, not only because there were some racist and nativist sentiments, but also because there was a lot of anger at what happened to the living standards of people who had worked their whole lives in blue collar work that disappeared on them and faced stagnating or declining wages. So I think we need a conversation that speaks simultaneously to racism and other forms of social injustice, but also speaks to the injuries of class, which affect people across a broad series of lines. And again, I go back to Bobby Kennedy, to somebody like Sherrod Brown, who in his 2018 campaign, you saw really appeal simultaneously to white working class people. He won a lot of those votes back. Interestingly, I think because of his history, Joe Biden may have an opportunity to do that, partly because his very identity puts him in a position to be trusted by many of the white working class voters Democrats need to win back, and whom I would like to see in alliance again, as they have been at other points in our history, with Black Americans, Latino Americans, and others.
Following up on that, EJ, I'm wondering whether that's a pretty tall order to keep white working class voters on side and have a smart conversation with them about opportunity and about the ability to achieve some security without also having to engage on the demographic anxiety among large numbers of white working class people that make it very hard for them to see economic common cause with Black and Latino working class people who are objectively in the same boat that they are. But every time you use the phrase white privilege, they blow a gasket, understandably perhaps, because it's very hard for them to see their privilege. But it also obscures the ability to have a conversation about these things or to win them over if they feel that one party or another is all in for people not like them.
Well, there are two answers to this. There is a narrow electoral answer, and then there's the larger hope. The narrow electoral answer is that people forgot that in order to work, the Obama coalition had to hit a certain percentage of white working class voters to win the states that needed to be won to win the presidency. I'm against the electoral college, but we can go there another day. But we have an electoral college. The number that sticks in my head, but it's typical of the numbers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan. In 2012, Barack Obama got 45% of the white non-college vote. Not a majority, but he got 45%. In 2016, Hillary Clinton got 34% of that same vote. So in order to create an electoral majority, you do not need in those key states a majority of the white non-college vote, but you do need numbers in the 40s, essentially. That is doable. Barack Obama did it. He did even better in 2008 with those voters. I have a hunch Joe Biden's going to do closer to those Obama numbers, which is why I think he is well positioned to win if something doesn't go haywire. And you saw that in 2018, where in races for governor and the Senate in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, 10 to 15% of Trump voters switched to Democratic candidates and allowed Democrats to win all of those races. Now, in the longer run, to create a stronger sense of national unity, we need a longer conversation. And a president, I think, has to be very intentional. I would love, if he wins, Joe Biden to be very intentional about trying to make this case and trying to show that it is possible to do things that simultaneously benefit people of color and white people who are in this economic circumstance. Having said all that, there is a racialized voting in the country, particularly in the South. The numbers in the South are different from those in the Midwest, and we're going to have to live with that. The last thing, the younger generation is different on these issues, and I always tell my kids that when their generation takes over and my generation is gone, I really think the country will be better. And the only problem is I want to be around to see it. So there's a contradiction in what I am telling my kids. But I do think that some of this is older white people, and it's less true of white Americans who are somewhat younger.
Molly?
Thanks, EJ. This question actually, I think, builds on what you just said about generational divides particularly well, which is to ask, how is it that Republicans have hijacked the position of being religious, despite many positions in opposition to most of our ideas of religious caretaking of our fellow humans, while Democrats are tagged as being irreligious?
So here's the problem. Democrats have a really difficult coalition management problem around religion. PRI, which Brookings, my colleague Bill Galston and I do a lot of work with at Brookings. PRI stands for the Public Religion Research Institute, have done some great work on this, where if you look at the Republican constituency, it is over 2/3 white and Christian. It is a very homogeneous coalition, so they can make a very clear appeal to more conservative white Christians. The Democratic coalition is not only more diverse racially, it's only about 1/3, a little more, maybe 37% white Christian. Obviously, it includes African Americans, Latinos, Jews, Muslims. It's a very broad coalition, but it also includes non-religious Americans. One of the biggest developments in the sociology of religion over the last 20 years is the rise of what are called the nuns, not N-U-N-S, the ones who taught me in grade school, N-O-N-E-S, the people who tell pollsters they have no religious affiliation. That number is now 40% for Americans under, I think it's 35. But it is growing exponentially. So the Democrats at election time have had some difficulty in talking about religion, because in a way they have the most religious people in America in their coalition, who are, by various sociological measures, African Americans would be that group, and the least religious people, who are the secular and the, including but not limited to atheists and agnostics. I always wish that Hillary Clinton had talked more about her faith in 2016. And when you actually, if you go back and look online at some of the speeches she gave to Methodist women about the role of her Methodist faith and Methodist Christian faith in making her a liberal. I always say I became a liberal because I am a Catholic, which seems odd to a lot of people these days, but would not be odd to people who grew up in my time. I wish she had done more of that. I think the difference this year, it was very striking that Joe Biden has not been reluctant to do that. Chris Coons gave that great little speech at the convention, really highlighting Joe Biden's faith. And I think you can appeal across the lines of believer and non-believer successfully. And by the way, there is the best case of that in our history, in some ways, or recent history, is Martin Luther King. When you look at how King preached about civil rights, he combined the scripture with our founding documents. And so many of King's key speeches were an appeal to living up to scripture and living up to our founding documents. And then lastly, I think the press often has been too willing to concede, or concede's the wrong word, to go along with a casting of religious people as being only on the right. And to the extent that you do that, evangelicals are conservative. Well, what about African Americans, Black Americans who are evangelical? They are not conservative. What about all the people who gather at churches like St. Columba's? So I think that the media also have a role to play. And I think the best religion reporters do this. Ray has certainly done this a lot. Portray the religious community in all its diversity politically as well as ethnically and racially. But anyway, that's a long answer. But short answer is Dems have a coalition problem, Republicans don't, and that gets in the way.
All right, I'm going to pose one last question to EJ and to Ray, if you have anything to add, and then we'll wrap up. And so my last question is going to sort of bring together a couple of questions that have been raised in the chat about voter suppression. So both what is sort of our responsibility as Christians to fight voter suppression? Do you think voter suppression is going to affect the outcome of the election? So on and so forth. So just if you could talk a little bit about how you think about voter suppression in this context, and what you think the consequences of it might be.
Let me quickly put on the table something that people can look up if they're interested. My colleague Miles Rappaport at the Ash Center for Democracy up at Harvard and I at Brookings did a report this summer proposing that the US adopt the Australian system of compulsory attendance at the polls. Now you would cast it as compulsory participation, which, by the way, does not mean you have to vote for anybody. It means you have to participate. But in Australia, this has lifted turnout to about 90%. One of the reasons I'm very much for the Australian system is that it totally reverses the obligations of those who run elections and those who legislate about them. Because if you have a duty to vote, then the job of election officials and the people who make laws around elections is to make it as easy as possible for you to do your duty. And so now that's not going to happen tomorrow morning. It may not happen ever in our history, although we're hoping we can see some experiments with it around the country. I am very concerned about voter suppression. I've been concerned about voter suppression ever since unfortunately, Republican states, again, you always sound, even when you don't want to sound partisan these days, you almost inevitably do, that Republican states have disproportionately been the ones that have sort of limited Sunday voting, limited early voting, required voter IDs, legislated in a way that suggests some real partisanship. In Texas, you can use your concealed carry permit provided by government, but students can't use their government IDs from their state universities. You wonder what that's about. Just last week, the governor ordered shutting down, said there could only be one early voting place to drop off ballots per county. What does that do in big, urban, diverse, more democratic counties? It is blatant voter suppression. So I am worried about that. I am worried about these calls from President Trump to watch the polls. Look at some of that Reconstruction history about voter intimidation that helped end Reconstruction. This has really negative echoes in our history. So I do worry about these things. Having said that, there seems to be a determination to vote in this election that you really saw the makings of in the 2018 election. In 2018, if you compare 2018 to 2014, Republicans got 10 million more votes in 2018 than they got in 2014, so their turnout went up. Democrats got 25 million more votes in 2018 than 2014. That's an enormous boost in turnout. You're seeing extraordinary applications for early ballots. In the end, I think the power of turnout will overwhelm a lot of the efforts to hold it back. You can only build so many dams to, a really a mighty stream, as Martin Luther King, put it about justice in the I Have a Dream speech. So I think there are limits to the capacity for voter suppression, but yes, we got to be on the lookout for it. And I'm glad you brought it up. And Ray, I'd like you to close on this and on anything else. And again, my gratitude to Ray, to Molly, to Reverend Laughlin, and Reverend Daniel, and to all of the congregants at this really great house of worship. You guys do wonderful things, and I'm honored to be part of it. Ray.
Well, it's a tribute to you, EJ, that there are still 105 people in the room. So
God love you all. Thank you.
When we do public speaking gigs and you notice the back of the room emptying out, you know that that's one kind of verdict. Well, that hasn't happened. So they're all still hanging in there. Go ahead.
I was going to say, it's how if one thinks of everybody in any line of work has a base, then it's not just politicians. And if moderate and progressive Christians can't be on my side, I am in really big trouble. So I am very grateful to every single one of you.
Well, I tell you, as I look over the last 6 months, there are abundant reasons to be disgusted with the way we do politics in America. There are abundant reasons to surrender to despair. And yet there are all kinds of markers that push back against that and argue against it. I look at the response to the pandemic, and my head's in my hands. I wonder, when I look at the politicized response to a public health challenge, whether we're capable in 2021 of being grown-ups about things, not small matters of arguing a couple of percentage points this way or that way, but big matters that involve just what kind of people and what kind of country we want to be. And this is a time of testing. I think there are, along with tremendous reasons for despair and disgust, a lot of reasons for hope. The institutions that make this country what it is have been shaken, but not crumbled to dust and fallen to the ground. We have a lot of internal strength that I think is going to sustain us, even in the midst of what is likely to be very ugly score settling, very ugly retribution that may commence with the seating of the new Congress. So I live in hope because I am a Christian, and that's part of the job. But also, as a reporter, you can't help but see all the things that are happening, all the things that are in train that might lead to a very distressing set of outcomes. So we're poised on the knife edge right now for the next 35 days or so, and watch this space. It's going to be a wild and unpredictable, and I hope not unfortunate next 5 weeks. We'll see what happens. I too have a very bulky crystal ball like EJ, so I'm not going to say anything. But I hope that we can come out on the other end of this ready to be decent to each other and ready to get to work on fixing the real problems of the country.
Amen.
And read Code Red by EJ Dionne.
God, thank you, Ray. Thank you so much. And hope is, we forget, hope isn't a feeling, hope is a virtue. So thank you for pointing that out.
And a vocation. So I look forward to seeing you all, and thanks for having me.
Thank
Thank you
you.
both very much.
Bless you all. Thanks so much.
Go in peace to love and serve the
Thank you.
Lord.
Bye.
And thank you all for being with us today.
Bye-bye.